Super excited to be here today. So I work for IBM in full transparency. What I want to talk about a little bit is, it just moved by itself. But anyways, what I want to talk about is how do we actually digitally transform governments using emerging technologies like blockchain. I'd like to start with a quote from our CEO because it's important to remember that humans and machines must coexist in order to actually move forward to transform societies. So before I kick off and get started, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a hacker. When I was 13 years old, I started building security systems for my school. In high school, they actually got adopted throughout the entire district. What we ended up doing was creating digital cards that scanned so you could actually know who was coming into schools. So that was sort of my foray into technology, into public sector technology. And I've continued doing that. So everybody always asks me, how did you get so smart? One of the things that I did do, I'm not going to name the education platform, but I would hack into an online education platform and grab all their content, right? And it was amazing because I sat in on many courses that I would have never sat on in the first place. So instead of going to work for the CIA, I ended up going to work for the White House. One of the greatest privileges of my career was working for President Obama, who I do miss dearly. And so the one thing I will say, though, is that, give you a quick joke, like I developed a memo for President Obama when he was meeting with Joseph Blatter, obviously now the former FIFA president, but one of the coolest moments was actually writing this memo in so much that he could connect with Joseph Blatter. And I had watched the International Confederations Cup, and I wrote about the Race Against Racism campaign, and the president chose my memo to read and use to actually then meet with Joseph Blatter. That was his prep memo. My biggest responsibility at the White House was actually taking the Recovery Act and figuring out how do we develop a system to, the first time in history, think about this, when we had the Recovery Act, it was the first time in history we started asking mom and pop stores to report in what they were doing with money. And there was no system in place to actually do it, so the reporting rates and errors were extremely high. So the first CTO, Anish Chopra, came into the White House, and so he started creating visualizations, but we also repurposed a system from the EPA in order to decrease the reporting errors from the MO921 guidance. So I say that because as I was leaving the White House, you always go and you ask the First Lady for advice. And she said to me, if you're not trying to help people, crawl over and die. You might say, use kind words, right? So what I did, though, it was a huge call to action for me. So I ended up starting a nonprofit to help kids in foster care. So instead of going to Yale and Harvard at the time for grad school, I felt like it was my duty to figure out how to help kids who were poor youth to become more successful because I was an adoptee, I was adopted as a kid. So I created Rate My Foster Home. We took it to market, sold the IP, got into a ton of other things. And my TEDx talk was actually about how to empower other social entrepreneurs to tackle social problems. And so if you're an entrepreneur, the one thing I would say is, this is outside of the scope of IBM, is focus on your business impact and brand. I'm not gonna go through my entire BIB methodology, but if you wanna go watch my TED Talk, feel free. So everybody always thinks that I joined IBM to teach robots how to dab, but that wasn't the case. So as much as we actually programmed Pepper to dab, which was amazing, but I actually joined IBM to figure out how to transform governments. So right now in the fourth industrial revolution, every government is struggling with their digital transformation. So to give you an example, like every government is trying to figure out how to economically reinvent themselves. So you're seeing made in Abu Dhabi, you're seeing made in Ghana, because everybody, the markets are changing and new markets are being shaped, and every country is trying to figure out how to capture the value within their border, right? So every day I wake up, I'm focused on how do I move a government from a basic e-government to a cognitive government. IBM has put a stake in the ground to say, how do we actually move governments to a cognitive government? How do we move Dubai from paperless to blockchain? How do we help the New York City Department of Homeless Services establish a new landlord management system using blockchain, right? And so all of these things are so complicated. So we created a framework that was based off the UN survey to actually look at and explore how to move those governments and to help governments identify where they're at in their journey. So we said, hey, let's move you from a basic e-government where everything you just could download to an actual cognitive government that's citizen-driven. So you move from closed architectures to open architectures and modular services. And that's where every government is trying to go right now. So the reason why I bring up the public sector is because in addition to that, government is creating their own investment vehicles to invest in technology. So in Oman, to give you an example, they created a huge fund. I wrote about it on my column, in which they're investing directly into startups. So governments are actually now investing directly into startups. So to give you an example of this, in the US, the Army is trying to reinvent itself. They said, the enemy knows what we do. They know our capability. So how do we actually reinvent ourselves? They took their Army Futures Command and they put it in the Capital Factory in Texas, which is one of the largest startup hubs in the US. And the reason why they did that was because they wanted to be able to scan for innovation. They said, we want to be able to scan the ecosystem for innovation. What ended up happening, they said to us, we know the startups can come up with the technology, but we need the bigs to ruggedize the technology, right? So the question is, how do you create the model by which industry and corporates, startups, and nonprofits and civil society and governments work together? And that's the model that I've been working to build at IBM. So to give you another example of this, the first place that this has started is governments getting engaged. So what we've seen recently is Denmark created the world's first tech ambassador. And they took the tech ambassador and placed him in Silicon Valley. So they believe, in their opinion, that the companies, their GDP, their revenues are going to be larger than countries' GDPs. And so they want to work with the tech giants, and so they created a whole new ambassadorship and put him in Silicon Valley. So we've been working with the tech ambassador to figure out how to create new models. And so what he has done is he's brought in so many delegations from governments to visit us to talk about how to transform. So to give you an example of how we built a blockchain, because everybody keeps talking about use cases, I think the use cases are already there. People are just not focused. So if you're talking about Michael Porter's strategy, right, it's like cost differentiation, focus, and that focus strategy is really what's missing, in my opinion, in the blockchain ecosystem. So to give you an example of this, we hosted a round robin of ministers from Denmark. And each of them, we asked them, what is your problem? What are you trying to solve? To Chris Williamson's point earlier, it's like, how can we get to that problem first, right? And so they all would come up with these interesting problems, and we would say, then they said, okay, which one are you going to spend money on? Because at the end of the day, a startup or a corporation is nothing without a customer and nothing without a business, right? A paying customer. So we said, hey, what are you willing to pay for? So the problem that Denmark had was with MSRAs and also cross-border sharing of the information. So they wanted to create, imagine this process just for a second. In Denmark, and this is common in many other countries, and they would walk up to, an inspector would go up to a refrigerator, record the temperature of the meat, put it on a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet then gets uploaded to the cloud, and then now they can look at it from a regulatory perspective. We said, hey, and they needed to ship that information when they ship meat to Japan, China, or wherever. They needed to actually show origination, right? And the temperatures that it was kept, all these different things. And it was interesting because we said, hey, we could actually put an IoT device on that, actually use blockchain to start doing the transfer of documentation to each other governments, as long as we have a player on the other side. But the biggest issue was we had to develop a consortium. So we had to bring Danfoss to the table. We had to bring so many other companies to the table. And so the lesson learned from that was, in order to do blockchain the right way, you need to go figure out the problem first, and then you need to say, okay, how can technology change that problem, right? Instead of saying blockchain needs to be introduced, like Colorado, for example, said they made it in their law that their technology, something must include blockchain. I was in Australia, and I had a minister tell me, oh, we want to include blockchain in something. That's not the way to go, right? The way to go is to say, here's my problem. Can we actually use this technology to solve that problem? And so I wanted to give you an example of this from a startup perspective in Australia, because I think this is helpful. So most people don't realize this, but in Australia, we actually weren't doing too well in Australia, and we had lost a contract, and so we had to rebuild that relationship in order for them to work with us. So the reason why I bring up Australia is because it was interesting because we had to rebuild it. But it's also a huge lesson. We just won a $1 billion whole of government transformation deal with Australia. And the reason why was because they wanted to change how they bought. So everybody knows this in this room. There's so many employees, so many different divisions at IBM. And sometimes you get lost in the shuffle. You don't necessarily know who to talk to, and so many different things. But what we said was, let's create an agile contract vehicle, put us on retainer as a law firm, and we'll drive the whole of IBM into your account, right? We'll give you design, we'll give you systems, whatever you need. So I went to Australia, negotiated the cloud hosting opportunities, and then we sat with all these government officials, and they fired questions at us the next day because we had a panel on blockchain and a whole half day with these ministers and government officials, department agency heads on blockchain. And they were throwing so many questions. Some of the questions, for example, was, can the blockchain be hacked? Network collusion, when can that happen? What else was one of the other things? Could you actually take over the blockchain? What happens if you lose your key? We don't want proof of work. We don't want proof of stake. We need permission. We don't want permissionless. We don't want public. So in those meetings, we learned what government wants and what they don't want. And it was amazing, right? But what was great was we ended up working with a startup agency in the government called Data 61. And Data 61 agreed to using our blockchain as a standard because there was no standard. So they said, we'll use your blockchain as a standard so that way we can bring innovation to government, right? So, and that was the concept. So we said, we'll lay the foundation, and then startups can build on our blockchain for government. They can build new businesses, they can create new economic opportunity, and that also leverages us from a cloud services perspective as well. And you can use other tooling, other tool sets, add it to the cloud, but it was all about how do we create a standard platform, and I'm not saying that Hyperledger or whatever fabric is the best, because there's so many different takes on it, right? But what we said was there is really no standard, so how do we use our platform in so much that it becomes a standard for innovation, for open innovation? And that was the message to Australia. There's obviously a ton of different other messages. For example, like I wanted to share a little bit about the a la carte method with open source banking. I'm not going to get into that too much, but we're also working here in Thailand to promote blockchain. So the government said, hey, we'd actually like to create a regional sales hub where we do reselling of technology. How do we do that, right? Because that was going to be their economic driver. And so I can explain a little bit more about that offline or during question and answer section, but I would encourage you to ask me a little bit more. So the reason why I'm here today and the reason why I accepted this, even though my market's primarily Europe and North America, and most people don't realize this, our business, IBM's government industry business, is the second largest industry within IBM. Our global government business is $9 billion, right? So, but the reason why I came here today is because in ASEAN, youth unemployment is a huge issue. And in order to mobilize folks, you actually need to, Roscoe's point, you need to talk to people who don't know blockchain, right? In order to get them excited, get them interested, start building and crafting those markets, because you need people, you need developers. So that's why I came today, and I thought it would be prudent for me to actually share our point of view. So we believe that new-collar jobs, that kids don't necessarily need college degrees in order to be successful. And the US Secretary of Labor actually said that microcredentialing is the wave of the future. Like, how can you actually stack credentials in so much that you increase your learning, and you can learn pretty rapidly? And you're seeing schools, Harvard, Yale, all these schools, create these online digital courses to test that model for micro-credentialing. And so what we've done is we created a 4-year program called PTech, where you can get a guaranteed job with IBM in an associate's degree in 6 years. Guaranteed job, associates, after that program. We also said, hey, why don't we create badging programs? So with my alma mater, we worked with them and created badging programs around blockchain that could actually count towards course credit. And then we said, hey, let's work on blockchain developer certificates and courses. And then we have partnerships with like Galvanize and many of the top startups because they provide blockchain education, so they end up becoming a feeder and as a recruitment arm for us. So the reason why I bring that up is I want to give you one example. Hannah came to IBM, and she worked, the girl with the purple hair, she came to IBM, and previously had graduated from college as a writer, and she said, I want to be a developer. In 3 years' time, she became the lead developer at IBM. She had blockchain developer courses, AI courses, and she was a rock star. I worked with her. She was the lead developer on one of my projects. She was a rock star. And so what we learned with Hannah, to give you an example, was that we need to talk with end users. And Hannah and I sat and talked, and we said, we launched a project, and we said we really need to talk to end users, but it's hard for us to do, right, in public sector. So I want to give you a quick example and why I think it's important for startups and to get into the space. So the California government issued a challenge to us and said, hey, we'd like to build emergency management applications for emergency and non-emergency applications. And it was crazy because during the time of the fires, I live in California, it was terrible. And so we created this application for them. But we ended up saying it was open source on our cloud platform. And I got to debunk a myth real quick. So everybody says that, you bought Red Hat, now you're doing open source. IBM was a first mover in open source. So as a result of antitrust laws, we opened up our architectures in the US to many other companies in many ways. So we were actually a first mover in open source. But the reason why I bring that up is, in order to talk to a government official, I had to cold call 100 different agencies to get a perspective to have just one person talk to me. Fortunately, I got a guy named Gil Zadolver from Ventura County who gave me 6 hours of his time. He told me how to create the category, how to create the what they used, what their tooling looked like, what their visualizations looked like, what their pain points were. And that was so critical because it actually allowed us to create a product that ended up, that the California government accepted, right? And so I give that as an example because we started to figure out how to change. How do we rapid prototype with governments? We already know they have problems digitally. I had a minister in, I'm not gonna tell you the country, tell me, Marquis, I don't know technology enough to pass technology policy, and I don't wanna set my country behind, right? Think about that for a second. You are responsible for changing the face of the future, and you have no idea what technology is. You have the right technology policy, and you don't know what technology is. That's a problem, right? So what we started to do is say, can we start rapid prototyping with end users? Can we give new insights to governments in different ways? So we started rapid prototyping with folks. We had partners, which is unheard of, standing on street corners talking to citizens, right? And which was amazing. But then we also said, we need to get jiggy with the ecosystem, right? Let's get jiggy with the ecosystem, because I'm an ecosystem guy. And so we worked with Microsoft, which everybody thought was a strange bedfellow, and everybody at IBM said it, but we worked with Microsoft, Citi, all these different companies to incubate about 1,000 different startups. We had demo days in so many different countries. It was absolutely amazing. So to give you an example of this, we picked 5 finalists, all right? And I said, hey, can we create a model for startups to join contract vehicles in so much that that's their channel to sales to government, right? Think about that. The public sector market, the incumbent, the IBMs, the Deloittes, who have those contract vehicles, can you leverage those contract vehicles, be it a blockchain startup, to gain access to government deal flow? And so I had 5 startups that won our challenge. One guy called me he had business in Bogota, in hand, one of our winners. And he said, hey man, like we don't adhere to any of these laws. How are we gonna take this money? And I said, hey, why don't I call my lawyers and see if we can get you on our contract vehicles? We'll be your sub and you guys can prime to the client, right? And they got the business. And it was all about enabling those startups to gain access to that deal flow. So the last thing I'll say is, this is a couple of examples. Like we have 10 startups, we created a new blockchain accelerator, and we have 10 startups in the wave of enterprise. So they're all over the place, but we're literally giving them access to deal flow. And I don't mean small deals. I'm talking 5, 10, 20, $30 million deals for these new startups. And think about a government contract. That could probably last 2, 3 years, 5 years. So that's deal flow that you automatically capture, right? So in ending my presentation, what I want to say is think about the youth in ASEAN and push for change for them. Push for change because the homeless person I saw on the street matters. Push for change because the mom on social services matters. But push for change together. Have a good day, guys. No time for questions.
We have a question. Stefan, you want to ask a question?
Thanks for that. It's very interesting. I wrote a few things down, and one is the keyword that I would like you to elaborate on. And you actually explicitly said, like, please ask me more about that. So I will. What is open source banking?
So open source banking is the idea. Application modernization in banking is really hard, right? And so, it's hella expensive. That's a word in California, is hella, which means really expensive, right? And so if you think about it, how can banks actually create an a la carte model in so much that they can offer those services in a la carte ways? So there's a group called BEON, which is the Banking Information and Architecture Network, that's actually creating these open banking models. And we've been supporting them in so much to do the application modernization for those banks. So to give you an example, I actually met with the Bank of Mandira. They visited the US just last week during or 2 weeks ago during our Think conference, and we said, they said, hey, what we're having a problem with was application modernization. And we said, why don't you offer an a la carte model using open banking as a platform?
I will look into it. Thanks.
My question is that, my background is 25 years of investment banking, and historically that the smaller companies, the incubators, the startups that have been acquired by or ran by larger corporations have typically been a disaster because you're talking about a culture that is rapidly growing. It doesn't have a lot of structure to it, and then you have these large corporations that just have these layers upon layers upon layers of bureaucracy, and they seem to clash. And historically, they've been just massive failures. What are you doing differently? And it seems like you're actually making significant progress, which is different than what I've experienced or seen.
So just as a heads up, I'm a startup founder and a product guy at my heart, right? And I care about people, not about money. And so what I came to IBM telling folks was, like, I created a product, and to give you an example really quickly, I created a product for New Jersey called RateMyFosterHome.com. The use case was that we wanted to get into governments and actually improve foster homes. So use NPS to get into to improve foster care systems to understand what's happening in foster homes in real time. They wouldn't remove a kid from a house unless they had 3 contact points, and the budget was like $10 million, and they weren't getting real-time insights. So in order to work with that government, right, I said, hey, I need a systems integrator. The systems integrator were being bullies. They were giving us 90-10 deals that didn't make sense. And like we were literally gonna be barely making it. So the reason why I bring that up is because I care about how do we actually get startups into government business and use them as a channel. So I'm not saying that let's buy all the startups, let's acquire them. I'm saying just use us as a channel to gain access to new deal flow. So imagine me as a Rate My Foster Home. I could say, hey, you have that contract in place. That contract costs $2 million just to get on, right? So you have this asset, essentially, but you're not using it in the way that you could be. So at IBM, the progress that I'm making in that saying is let's use our contract vehicles differently. And let's use them to get blockchain startups, AI startups, IoT startups. Let's get them in the door. So the model that we created is saying, hey, I don't know if you're familiar with service level agreements, but on a service level agreement, there's certain hours innovation hours that you can give to a client. So when I worked at Case Commons, we used to give them like 100 innovation hours. So instead of us giving them innovation hours, instead of us, IBM just going in and giving them talks and all this stuff, can we bring in startups? Can we give them our stage? And that's what we've started to do. So, and that's what I'm doing. So I hosted like the Singapore Defense, and I said, hey, this Army blockchain startup, come and use my platform and share your message and mingle with my client, because I think they'll like your message, right? And that's how we're changing, is sharing our stage, sharing our access, and sharing our contract vehicles. It's IBM. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for those great questions. Ladies and gentlemen, Marquis Cabrera.
There's never been a tulip mania that's done that.